Rain pressed against the windows like a hand that would not let go. Giancarlo Benedetti sat in the back of the armored sport utility vehicle and watched the gate slide shut behind him, slow and obedient. The neighborhood outside his estate was clean in a way that felt unnatural. Perfect hedges, perfect driveways. Even the street lights looked expensive. It was the kind of place where danger was supposed to be a rumor, not a visitor. Frankie Napoli drove without speaking. His hands stayed steady on the wheel. His eyes stayed forward. The car smelled faintly of leather and gun oil, and Carlo liked it that way. Scents were honest. People were not. At the curb, under the weak glow of a security lamp, the staff had lined up to watch him leave. Heads bowed, shoulders tight, everyone performing loyalty the way people performed prayer. Carlo did not look at the line for long. He gave Frankie the same instruction he gave when signing a contract that would ruin someone. Simple, final. If I find out she is hurting them, I want her gone before midnight. No trace. Frankie did not argue. He never did. In this house, truth traveled slowly, and fear traveled fast. Carlo leaned back and closed his eyes for a single breath, letting the rhythm of rain on the roof settle into his bones. He could still hear Dolores in his head, her voice soft and worried, as if the concern itself was a gift. That Reese girl does strange things with your boys when you are gone, sir. The children do not cry anymore. Babies are supposed to cry. Carlo had nodded that morning, because grief made him reckless, and fear made him cruel. Since Catalina died, his world had narrowed to a list of threats, enemies outside the gate, weakness inside the walls, silence in rooms that used to hold laughter. Silence was supposed to mean peace. Silence was supposed to mean control. But Dolores had handed him a different meaning, and it had caught fire in his chest. A father who cannot protect becomes a father who punishes. Carlo had punished before. It was what he knew. The vehicle turned, the tires hissing on wet pavement. Frankie said the flight to Miami was confirmed. The sit-down, the story, the alibi. Carlo listened like a man listening to someone read a menu he had already memorized. When the vehicle reached the main road, Carlo tapped Frankie's shoulder once. Frankie pulled to the curb without asking why. Carlo stepped out into the rain. Cold water hit his face immediately, sliding down his jaw, soaking into his collar. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand. The case looked heavy, official, important. It was none of those things. It held no documents, no money, no gun. It held suspicion. The street was quiet, only the sound of rain and distant tires. Carlo walked away from the vehicle without looking back. He moved through the neighborhood like a man visiting a world that had never belonged to him. Even though he owned more of it than anyone would admit out loud, he had oiled every hinge in the mansion himself the night before, wiping metal with a cloth until the doors stopped whispering when they moved. He knew every sound his house could make. He knew which creak belonged to which step. He knew how silence could hide a lie. Tonight, he wanted silence. He wanted to enter like a shadow and catch the truth in the act. He reached the side entrance and stood under the overhang for a moment, letting rain drip off his hair onto the stone. The air smelled of wet earth and trimmed boxwood. Somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler system clicked on and off like a nervous habit. Carlo placed his palm against the door and felt the cold wood through his skin. The lock turned without resistance. It did not squeal. The hinge did not complain. The door opened as smoothly as if the house had been waiting for him. Inside, the foyer swallowed him. The mansion was quiet in a way that made the hair at the back of his neck tighten. Not the calm quiet of sleep, the other kind, the quiet that comes from rules, from staff trained to disappear. from grief that has been forced into every corner until it becomes part of the architecture. The air carried faint traces of polish and citrus cleaner, and beneath that, something older, like dust that never fully left. The marble floor reflected the chandelier like a frozen lake. Carlo stepped in, closed the door behind him, and paused. He expected noise. He expected panic. He expected the television loud enough to cover neglect. He expected to hear one of the twins crying, thin and frantic, the kind of cry that turns a father's blood into poison. Nothing. He held his breath and listened harder. The briefcase handle pressed into his fingers until his knuckles whitened. Still nothing. His mind ran through the list anyway. He saw images before he reached any room. Reese asleep on the sofa, bottles unwashed, a child alone in a crib, a bruise, a mark, a silence that meant fear. Carlo moved forward, slow, careful, as if the house could explode if he stepped too hard. His shoes made no sound on the oak because the runners were thick and the staff kept them perfect. He passed the corridor where a framed photograph of Catalina used to hang. It was gone now. Carlo had taken it down after the funeral because he could not bear her eyes watching him fail. He kept walking. Then he heard it. At first it did not register, because his brain did not have a place to put it. The sound came from the living room, spilling down the hall like warm light under a door. Laughter, not a polite chuckle, not the soft, careful laugh adults use in houses that are mourning. This was full-bodied laughter, the kind that shakes ribs and steals breath, the kind that almost sounds like screaming if you are not used to joy. It was his sons, Arlo and Joe. Carlo stopped so suddenly his muscles locked. His throat tightened. The hallway seemed to narrow around him, the walls closing in as if the house itself were trying to hold him still. He had not heard that kind of laughter in this home since the night before Catalina died. Carlo's grip on the briefcase loosened without him noticing. His hand trembled once, barely, then went still again. His chest hurt in a way fear could not explain, because the laughter was real, and because it did not belong to him. He took one step toward the living room doorway, then another, moving as if each footfall could shatter the moment. The laughter rose, bright and reckless, filling the mansion with something it had not allowed in a long time. Carlo reached the edge of the doorway and stopped just short of being seen. He did not blink. He did not breathe. He listened to his sons laughing, like the world outside did not exist. And for the first time since Catalina's death, Carlo felt a threat that had nothing to do with enemies. He felt the threat of losing control to something gentler than him. Carlo stayed half a step behind the doorway, letting the frame hide him the way shadows hid men in basements and alleys. The laughter rolled out in waves, bright and reckless, and it did something humiliating to his body. It made him want to believe. He tightened his jaw until his molars ached and looked into the living room. The space should have looked like a showroom. Cream, Italian leather, gold-framed art that meant nothing. The Persian rug Catalina had bought in Istanbul. The one Carlo treated like a sacred relic because it still held the faintest trace of her perfume if he knelt close enough. Today, it looked lived in, not messy, not destroyed, alive. On the rug, Reese Holloway lay flat on her back like she'd offered herself as the floor. Her dark hair was tied loose at the nape of her neck, a few strands stuck to her cheek with sweat. Her blue uniform was wrinkled from movement, the fabric pulled tight across her ribs. Both arms were raised, and on her hands were cheap yellow rubber gloves. Bright, ugly, wrong in this room. Dollar store yellow against a house that swallowed money like air. Arlo stood on her chest, tiny canvas shoes planted like flags, arms lifted in triumph. His face was split open with laughter, baby teeth flashing, eyes squeezed shut in pure, careless joy. And then Carlo saw Gio. The smaller twin stood on Reese's stomach, knees trembling, his hands clutching her shoulders, as if she were the only solid thing left in the world. His mouth was open, laughter spilling out of him in sharp bursts that sounded too big for his body. Gio's legs shook, buckled once, then held. Held. Carlo's stomach dropped. He remembered Dr. Whitfield's careful voice in the clinic 3 months ago, explaining severe motor delay, muscle tone weakness, long road, lowered expectations, spoken like a polite apology. Carlo had listened to every word, as if information could control fate. Now Gio stood anyway, standing on a woman's stomach like it was the most natural place to learn what gravity meant. "Hurricane warning," Reese shouted, voice full of exaggerated drama. She rocked her torso gently side to side, making the boys sway like trees in wind. Arlo leaned with it and laughed harder, refusing to grab on, trusting his own balance like it was a game he could win by willpower. Gio tightened his grip, lips pressing together for a second, as if he was trying to keep his courage from leaking out. Then he laughed again when he realized he was still upright. Reese's gloved hands held their ankles steady. Sure, the rubber gripping fabric and sock in a way bare skin couldn't. Morning light cut through the tall garden doors, turning dust into floating gold. For one impossible moment, the room looked like a picture someone might frame. Chaos held up by trust. Carlo did not see trust. His mind did what it always did. It scanned for red numbers, the gloves, yellow rubber. He imagined cleaning chemicals. He imagined residue. He imagined Gio's skin absorbing poison through thin socks because fear did not need science. Fear only needed a picture, the height, less than half a meter. In his head, it stretched into a cliff. Gio falling. Gio's skull on oak. Cold white hospital lights. A doctor asking why. Catalina on a gurney 16 months ago. Blood replacing her face in his memory. The insult. His sons, Benedetti, blood balanced like circus performers on the floor, made to play by a girl with no name and no pedigree. Dolores's label slid across his thoughts like oil. Street trash. Carlo had never challenged it because it had been convenient to believe. Convenient to think someone without a family couldn't possibly know how to care for someone else's. And beneath all of it, under the germs and the height and the rug, was the real thing twisting inside him. Control. Since Catalina died, control had been the only heir he trusted. He controlled his empire with iron. He controlled the house with schedules precise to the minute. He controlled the children with staff, cameras, bodyguards. He controlled his grief by sealing it inside a steel box in his chest and pretending it was locked forever. Now, in this living room, a 27-year-old stranger was reaching his sons in a way he never had. They were laughing for her, standing for her, trusting her body like it was home. And Carlo, who could buy silence, could not buy that sound. A pulse throbbed hard in his throat. His vision narrowed, sharp at the edges. He took one step into the room without meaning to, the briefcase hanging useless at his side. He stopped again, but the damage was already done. His presence was a weight. He found her name in his mouth before his brain could catch it. Re. It wasn't a shout. It was worse. Low. Dense. A single syllable dropped like a hammer. The effect was immediate. Reese's body locked as if electricity had run through her spine. Every muscle tightened in one reflexive brace. Not the brace of someone playing, but the brace of someone who had learned what a man's growl meant when it filled a room. Arlo's laughter shattered into a cry mid-breath. Gio's eyes flew open, joy evaporating into panic as the air turned cold. Gio turned his head toward the doorway, toward Carlo's voice, and that tiny movement stole the balance he'd been holding with everything he had. His left foot slid, his body tipped to the right, toward the oak floor. Time slowed into slices. Carlo lunged forward, briefcase slipping from his hand and slamming onto the floor with a dull thud that sounded too loud in the suddenly dead room. His shoes skidded on polished wood. He was still too far. Reese moved before his second step finished. Her right hand shot up, palm cradling the back of Gio's neck, fingers wrapping his skull with instinctive precision. She pulled him into her chest before he dropped even an inch closer to the floor. Her left arm wrapped Arlo's waist, pinning him tight, and in the same motion she rolled to the side, sitting up with both boys pressed against her, like she'd been built to catch falling things. Less than 2 seconds, faster than Carlo, faster than any guard he'd paid. The twins began to scream raw, lung-ripping cries, the kind that felt like needles driven into Carlo's ears. The sound Dolores had used as a weapon now filled the room like floodwater. Carlo's chest burned. The boss in him wanted blame the way fire wanted oxygen. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and bent down without thinking. His fingers closed around Arlo and yanked him out of Reese's arms. Arlo jerked back, stunned for a heartbeat, then screamed louder, thrashing against Carlo's suit, tears and mucus smearing into cashmere. Carlo held the child tight with one arm and extended his other hand toward Reese. Palm up, a command, not a request. Let go of my child. Reese lifted her head and met his eyes from the floor. Gio clung to her shirt with both fists, knuckles white. Reese did not move immediately, not defiant, not brave, just refusing to peel a terrified child away from the only thing keeping him steady. For a beat, the room held its breath. Then Reese whispered something Carlo couldn't hear, her voice low and shaking with restraint. She pried Gio's fingers loose one by one, careful, gentle, and set him down beside Arlo. The twins turned toward each other, clinging and crying like they only had each other left. Reese rose slowly. When she stood fully upright, she seemed taller than he'd measured her to be, not because of inches, but because of the way she held her spine straight, uncrushable. Carlo's voice went flat, marble cold. You have 10 minutes to leave this house. Minute 11 won't be pleasant. Reese did not beg. She did not plead her case. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes shone without spilling. She looked at him like she was memorizing the shape of his cruelty. You'll regret this, she said. 4 words, steady enough to cut. Then she turned and walked out of the living room, leaving the yellow rubber gloves on the Persian rug like dropped pieces of sunlight no one deserved. And Carlo stood there with his sons screaming into his neck, watching her disappear down the hall, feeling the room empty in a way that had nothing to do with space. The front door did not slam. It only clicked shut. That small sound carried farther than it should have, as if the house had been hollowed out and turned into an echo chamber. Carlo stood in the living room with both boys in his arms, their cries scraping his skin raw. Arlo's face was purple with panic. Gio's fists opened and closed against Carlo's shirt, like he was trying to grab something that wasn't there anymore. Carlo rocked them the way he'd seen other people rock them. Too fast, too stiff, mechanical. The motion did nothing but rub his own helplessness deeper into his throat. He took a step over the Persian rug and stopped when his shoe brushed the yellow gloves. The rubber squeaked faintly against the weave, a small, ugly sound. He looked down at them the way he looked at anything he did not understand, like it was a threat that needed a name. The crying got worse. Carlo moved to the cribs, as if the nursery was a switch he could flip, as if a room designed for comfort would force comfort into their bodies. He carried them down the hallway, past framed art, past closed doors, past the neat order of a house that had never once learned how to soothe. He set them into the cribs one by one. Arlo screamed the moment his back touched the mattress. Gio screamed like the air had turned to needles. Carlo stared at them through the white slats. He reached in, tried to pat their backs the way Reese had. His palm felt too big, too heavy, like a glove made of stone. Gio flinched, as if touch itself had become dangerous. Carlo withdrew his hand. He tried music next. He walked to the wall panel, tapped through options with impatient fingers, and filled the house with classical strings. The sound was clean, expensive, hollow. The boys screamed over it, their cries punching holes through every note. He tried bottles. He did not know where the formula was kept. He opened drawers, cabinets, a pantry door. Everything was labeled in a staff language Carlo had never had to learn. His fingers shook as he scooped powder into a bottle, spilled some on the counter, cursed under his breath, wiped it away, tried again. When he finally pushed the bottle into Arlo's mouth, Arlo knocked it aside like an insult. Milk splattered across Carlo's suit. Warm, sticky, it seeped into the fabric and turned the scent of expensive cologne sour. Carlo stood in the nursery under the soft nightlight, drenched in his children's panic, and realized there was no muscle in his body trained for this kind of fight. He lifted Gio again and began to pace. 1 step, 2, 3, the same loop across the living room, back and forth like a caged animal. He tried to sing. A melody surfaced, an Italian lullaby Catalina used to hum, but the words were gone, burned away by grief. His voice came out rough and dry, scraping the air. The boys cried harder. Carlo's jaw tightened until it hurt. He pressed Gio to his chest, tried to breathe through the sound, tried to tell himself the crying would pass, that children forgot quickly, that this was only the absence of routine. But the crying was not routine. It was loss. 15 minutes later, Dolores appeared in the doorway like a solution that had been waiting for its cue. She moved slowly, hands folded at her stomach, face carefully arranged into concern. Her voice slid into the room, sweet enough to coat the pain. "Poor babies," she said, reaching for Gio. Carlo turned away on instinct. He did not want anyone else touching them now, not even her. Dolores's smile did not falter. She tilted her head, listening to the cries as if they confirmed something for her. "That girl must have frightened them so much they can't stand her absence," Dolores murmured. "I told you. A street girl like that. She doesn't know how to raise decent children." Carlo's throat was tight. He wanted the words to be true, because truth would mean he had been right. Right meant control. Control meant the world still made sense. He nodded once. The nod tasted like metal. Something about Dolores's timing scratched at the inside of his skull. She had appeared exactly when the crying peaked, exactly when he was most desperate for comfort. Her eyes flicked, just once, toward the living room floor, toward the yellow gloves, still on the rug, then back to him. That glance wasn't concern. It looked like victory wearing a mask. Carlo's stomach turned, but the boys screamed and the sound drowned his instincts. Dolores spoke a few more soft lines, then drifted away toward the kitchen corridor with steps that were too light for a woman who claimed to be pained by this. Carlo kept pacing. Minutes stretched. The cries changed shape. They became lower, steadier, less explosive, and somehow worse. A relentless keening, the kind that meant tears had run out but pain had not. It reminded Carlo of a sound he had made once, alone in a locked bathroom 3 days after Catalina's funeral, forehead against cold tile, making a noise that was not crying anymore, but something deeper. His arms began to shake, not from emotion, from strain. He had held men at gunpoint without trembling. He had signed orders that ended lives without blinking. But holding 2 small bodies through endless grief was a different kind of weight. He lowered Arlo to the rug. Arlo curled on his side, sobbing in small, broken pulls. He lowered Gio beside him. Gio's face was red and swollen, his mouth open in a sound that barely had air behind it now. Carlo sank onto the edge of the Italian leather sofa. His hands covered his face. He closed his eyes for 3 seconds because he could not watch one more second of his children hurting. In those 3 seconds, the house made a small sound. Not crying, not music, not footsteps from staff. A creak, oak shifting under a tiny weight. Carlo opened his eyes. Gio was no longer where Carlo had placed him. The smaller twin had rolled, dragged, and somehow reached the base of the sofa. His hands gripped the leather cushion, fingers whitening as he pulled. His legs, those weak legs, those trembling legs pressed into the floor. Carlo's breath stopped. Gio's knees buckled once, then straightened. His body rose, unsteady, swaying, but upright. He stood there, holding the sofa edge, as if it was the only anchor in the world. Carlo did not move. He was afraid any sound would break the moment, like glass. Gio released one hand, then the other. For 1 second he stood free, wobbling like a young tree in wind, but not falling. Then his right foot lifted barely an inch and set down forward. A step. Carlo felt something inside his chest crack open. Not pain, but a floodgate giving way. Gio took a second step. Higher, more certain. His body wobbled, but he fought gravity the way Reese had taught him without knowing it was teaching. A third step, and by the third step, Carlo understood where Gio was going. Not toward toys, not toward milk, not toward Carlo, toward the doorway, toward the hall, toward the front door, toward the place Reese had vanished. Gio's mouth moved. A sound formed, warped by a tongue still learning language. Re. The syllable came out like a tremble. Then again, with the next step, Ray. Arlo saw his brother moving and went silent for a heartbeat. Stunned, then scrambled up on his stronger legs. He ran not to Gio but to Carlo, grabbed two of Carlo's fingers, and pulled with surprising strength, dragging him toward the door like a command. Ray, Arlo cried, not in pain now, but calling. Carlo's knees gave out. He did not decide to kneel. His body simply refused to hold the weight of what he was seeing. He knelt on the oak floor of his own living room, staring at his son walking toward a closed door, fueled by a name Carlo had thrown out of the house. And in the stillness between footsteps, the yellow rubber gloves on the Persian rug seemed to glow like evidence. Carlo swallowed hard, the sound loud in his own ears. His gaze lifted toward the hallway, and something inside him shifted cold certainty, cracking into something sharp and unbearable. He did not know the shape of the next thing he would do yet. He only knew he had to see the truth. Carlo did not remember standing. He remembered motion and the way his body moved before his mind could label it. His fingers tightened around Arlo's small hand, then released. He lifted Gio gently, the boy still making that thin sound re, as if the name itself held balance inside it. Carlo carried both boys back toward the nursery with a speed that felt wrong in a house built for slow, quiet ritual. The hallway lights were too bright. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and expensive wood. Everything looked polished enough to hide blood, which was a thought Carlo hated for how naturally it came. He placed the twins in the crib together because separating them felt like cruelty. Arlo clung to Gio's shirt. Gio's legs twitched in sleep-like exhaustion, even though his eyes stayed open. Red-rimmed, searching. Carlo stood there for a beat, hands hovering uselessly above them. He wanted to promise something. He did not trust promises anymore. Not his own. Downstairs, the living room sat in its false calm. The yellow gloves were still on the rug where Reese had dropped them. Two bright stains against Catalina's dark weave. Carlo stared at them. and felt his earlier disgust twist into something else, something colder. Evidence. He turned and walked. The path to the basement did not creak. The stairs were stone. The air cooled with each step, the scent shifting from citrus polish to metal and dust. Halfway down, the hum of electronics reached him steady, indifferent, a sound that never lied. At the bottom was the steel door. Carlo's palm found the keypad. The buttons beeped softly under his fingers. A quick sequence, a final beep. The lock released with a muted clunk. Inside, the security room glowed blue. 16 screens covered the wall, each one a silent eye. Hallways, gates, the driveway, the kitchen, the nursery corridor, the living room corner camera with the clearest view of the Persian rug. Frankie Napoli was already there, seated in front of the monitors with his back straight, arms crossed, as if he had been waiting for the exact shape of this moment. The light from the screens carved hard angles into his face. He did not ask why Carlo was there. He did not pretend surprise. Frankie had been paid for loyalty, but he had survived by reading shifts in Carlo's silence. Carlo pulled a chair and sat without looking away from the wall of screens. His voice came out low and worn, stripped of the earlier growl. "Rewind 3 weeks," he said. "Living room. Everything." Frankie's hands moved to the keyboard. Keys clicked. A soft beep. The screens flickered, then snapped into a different time. A digital timestamp in the corner, clean and unforgiving. Camera 3, living room. 21 days earlier. Reese sat on the floor with Gio in her lap. The baby was crying high, helpless, the kind of cry Carlo's house had tried to erase. Reese's mouth moved constantly, talking to him in a calm rhythm, even though the camera had no sound. Her hands held his feet, bending knees up and down, slow, patient, like she was teaching his body a language his nerves did not know yet. Carlo leaned forward. Reese laid Gio on the rug, then lay back herself. She guided Gio onto her stomach. Yellow gloves flashed in the frame. She held his ankles, not tight, just steady. Gio stood for half a second. Then he tipped. Reese caught him. Reset. He tipped again. Reset. Again. Reset. Carlo's eyes tracked the pattern until his brain began counting without permission. Fail, catch, reset. Fail, catch, reset. The footage did not cut away. It did not dramatize. It just showed the same thing repeated with a stubborn kind of love. Frankie fast-forwarded. The timestamp jumped. Day 8. Gio stood longer. 3 seconds. His legs shook like thin wires. Reese's face changed, her mouth tightened, her eyes widened, and even without audio, Carlo could see her holding back emotion like it might spook the child. Gio fell on the 4th second. Reese caught him and reset him. The same calm motion. No anger. No exhaustion visible. Frankie tapped again. Day 10. 10 seconds. Carlo felt the back of his throat burn. He had hired specialists. He had paid doctors. He had bought machines. He had built schedules. And here was Reese on the floor with a baby and 2 rubber gloves, turning time into progress by refusing to stop. Frankie switched feeds. Kitchen camera. Timestamp. 2:17 a.m. The kitchen was dark except for a small under-cabinet light. Reese sat on a stool at the island, phone pressed to her ear. Her shoulders shook. Tears fell down her face with no attempt to hide them because she thought no one was watching. Her mouth moved, pleading, promising, listening, breaking. Then she ended the call and sat with her face in her hands for a single minute, shaking silently. A sound rose through the baby monitor on the counter, Gio crying upstairs. Reese jolted upright like she had been struck. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, opened the fridge, pulled out milk, and moved with quick, practiced steps. She prepared a bottle with hands that still trembled from crying, then disappeared up the stairs. Timestamp 2:23 a.m. Carlo stared at the screen. He tasted something bitter behind his teeth. He had been in the house that night, 10 steps away, sleeping in a room too quiet. Frankie paused the footage. The room hummed. The monitors cast light over Carlo's hands, and for the first time in 16 months, he noticed his fingers shaking. He reached out and shut off the screens one by one. The wall went dark. Only the system lights blinked, small and steady, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Carlo sat in that darkness longer than he meant to. When he finally spoke, his voice did not aim at Frankie. It aimed at the air, at the empty space where Catalina had once stood, at a grief he had tried to lock away. "What have I done?" Frankie's chair creaked softly as he shifted. He did not let the silence heal Carlo. He did not let it become comfort. His voice was careful, flat, like a man placing a blade on a table and warning you not to grab it wrong. "Boss," Frankie said, "there's one more thing you need to see." Carlo lifted his head. Frankie's eyes stayed on the dark wall of monitors, as if looking at Carlo directly might spark something dangerous. "It's not about the nanny," Frankie said. "It's about Dolores." Carlo's stomach tightened. That small, sharp doubt from earlier, the glance at the gloves, the timing, the sweet voice with a metallic aftertaste, pressed harder now. No longer a grain of sand, but the beginning of a crack. Carlo nodded once. "Open it," he said. Frankie turned the screens back on. The room filled with blue light again, and somewhere deep in the house, the silence felt suddenly less like peace and more like a lid about to lift. Frankie split the wall of monitors into 2 feeds. Upstairs hallway, master bedroom door. The timestamp in the corner changed, then steadied. Carlo watched the corridor as if it were a throat he had trusted for years, without ever checking what moved through it. Dolores appeared at the far end. She did not walk the way she walked when she knew she was being observed. Her steps were quick, almost sharp. Her head turned once, left, right. A motion Carlo recognized from men about to do something they would deny later. She stopped at the master bedroom door and reached into her apron. A small brass key flashed in her fingers. Carlo's spine went rigid. The door opened. Dolores slipped inside. Frankie switched to the master bedroom camera. The angle caught the vanity corner Carlo had kept untouched since Catalina's death, the rosewood jewelry box sitting like a shrine. Dolores moved toward it without hesitation. No pause, no reverence. Her hands opened the box with the same casual certainty she used when setting out breakfast. She lifted the diamond necklace first, held it up to the light as if weighing it, then the pearl earrings, then the sapphire ring. One by one, she slid the pieces into her coat pocket. Carlo felt heat rise in his stomach, slow and thick. Not the explosive anger he used on enemies. Something older, something uglier. The kind of rage that did not need to shout because it already knew what it would do. Frankie advanced the footage. The screens jumped. A side gate camera came up. The narrow service path behind the house glistened with rain. Dolores stepped into frame carrying a small cloth bag. She paused near the gate, and a man appeared from the alley beyond the fence. Black jacket, cap pulled low, face half hidden. Dolores handed him the bag. He handed her an envelope. The exchange took seconds. Clean, practiced, like a routine repeated, until it stopped feeling wrong. Carlo's mouth went dry. Frankie's voice stayed flat, but his fingers tapped the desk as if holding back his own reaction. "I ran the face," Frankie said. "No match in our database, but I traced the vehicle he used." He did not say the location yet. He let the silence stretch. just long enough for Carlo to feel the hook sink deeper. The registration leads to a shell company, Frankie continued. Brighton Beach. The words hit the room like a cold object dropped into still water. Carlo did not move, but something in his eyes sharpened. Brighton Beach was not just a neighborhood. It was a signal, a border, a warning sign that had already cost him a wife. Frankie brought up another file, a list of phone calls pulled cleanly from the house network logs. Numbers highlighted, a pattern of repeated contact. She called them regularly, Frankie said, multiple times a week. For months, Carlo stared at the call log until the lines blurred. Months meant planning. Months meant intent. Months meant Dolores had been living in his home, feeding his children, pouring tea, and selling the map of his life in small, quiet pieces. He looked at his reflection on the dark edge of one monitor. The face staring back looked older than it had an hour ago. The same eyes, but emptied of something soft he did not remember losing. He had trusted Dolores for decades because she was familiar, because her age felt like proof, because she spoke gently, because she had been there long enough that he stopped questioning why. Now he saw what time really was. Time was patience. Time was cover. Time was the slowest weapon in the world. Frankie shifted in his chair. He did not look at Carlo when he spoke next. I should have told you sooner, he said. Carlo turned his head. Slow. Sooner, Carlo repeated, voice low. Frankie's jaw tightened. I watched the nanny, Frankie said. I never saw harm. I never saw neglect. I saw devotion. But Dolores kept insisting. And you trusted Dolores. He paused, choosing words like a man stepping around broken glass. I was afraid to contradict you, Frankie admitted. Not because I feared you. Because if I was wrong, and the children got hurt, I would never forgive myself. Carlo held Frankie's gaze for a long moment. Then he looked back at the screens. It was not just Dolores who had betrayed him. It was the atmosphere he had built, the one where nobody spoke the truth, unless it matched his anger. He had created a house where fear was safer than honesty. And Dolores had used that fear like a key. Carlo stood. His movements were controlled, but the air around him felt dangerous in a different way now. Not heat, not explosion. A deep, steady, cold. Print the frames, Carlo said. Everything that matters. Frankie nodded once, already moving. Carlo left the security room without another word. He climbed the stairs as if gravity had changed, each step heavy and deliberate, and he walked into his study, dark walnut panels, a desk that had witnessed decisions that ended men. He sat down and waited. When Frankie entered, he carried a brown envelope, thick. Carlo opened it. Glossy photos slid out onto the desk, bright under the lamp. Dolores at the jewelry box. Dolores pocketing the necklace. Dolores at the gate. The man in the cap. The envelope exchange. Screenshots of calls, numbers circled, dates lined up like a marching order. Carlo stared at the evidence until his breathing steadied into something calm. Then he spoke two words that sounded like a door locking. Call her. Minutes later, Dolores walked into the study. Her face wore concern like a uniform. Hands folded, eyes soft. A grandmother entering to soothe chaos. But Carlo saw the small flicks now. The quick scan of the room. The way her smile arrived a fraction too late. Carlo did not accuse. He did not raise his voice. He laid the photographs down one by one. Slow, like dealing cards. Dolores watched the first image, then the second, then the third. Color drained from her skin, as if the pictures were pulling life out of her. Her knees hit the floor. Carlo, she gasped, hands clasped. Please. I had no choice. Carlo's fingers tapped the desk, steady, measured. When her begging broke into sobs, he finally spoke, quiet enough that she had to stop breathing to hear him. "You carried Catalina into this house," Carlo said, "and you sold me to the man who killed her." Dolores's mouth opened. No sound came. Carlo stood and buttoned his vest, the motion precise, almost gentle. "You have 5 minutes," he said. "You take nothing. You contact no one. You speak my family's name to anyone, and Frankie will visit you." The study door opened. 2 guards appeared. As they lifted Dolores, her mask cracked fully. The sweetness vanished. Something sharp and hateful took its place. "That street girl is who you should have thrown out," Dolores spat, voice shrill. "She will destroy your family. You will see." Carlo did not turn. He stared out the window at the garden where Catalina once planted roses. And for the first time that day, he understood something with perfect clarity. He had thrown the wrong person out, and the one he had pushed into the night was now standing alone in a city full of enemies who did not care what she knew. Carlo reached for his phone. Carlo's thumb hovered over Frankie's name for half a heartbeat before he pressed call. The line connected on the first ring. Frankie's voice came through low and alert, the sound of a man already standing. "Boss, lock everything," Carlo said. His words came fast, clipped, and each one landed like a command hammered into steel. "Change gate codes. Reset every camera password. Double coverage. Sweep the house for anything she could have planted. Now." Frankie didn't ask why. Keys clacked in the background. A door opened somewhere. Footsteps moved at a run. "Done," Frankie said, and Carlo ended the call without goodbye. He stood alone in the study with the photographs still spread across his desk like a crime scene. The lamp made the glossy paper shine. Dolores's hands in Catalina's jewelry box. Dolores at the side gate. A stranger in a cap. An envelope exchange. Carlo's pulse slowed into something colder. Then a new thought cut through him, sharp as glass. Reese. Dolores had access to personnel files, addresses, phone numbers, schedules. She had lived in this house for 30 years, moving through it like she owned the walls. And for 4 months, she'd been feeding pieces of Carlo's life to the same network that had planted a bomb under his Mercedes. If Petrov's people were circling, Reese was not just a discarded employee. She was a loose end. Carlo left the study and walked down the hall toward the nursery. The lights felt too clean. The house smelled like polish and money, and it made him sick. He stopped outside the nursery door and listened. Silence. Inside, Arlo and Gio slept curled together in one crib, their bodies pressed close, as if they had learned in one day what Carlo took a lifetime to understand, that safety was a warm body beside you, not a fortress. Carlo stared at their faces in the dim nightlight. Gio's lips were slightly parted. His hands still held the edge of the blanket, as if gripping a memory. Arlo's cheek rested against his brother's head, protective even in sleep. Carlo did not touch them. He turned away, already moving, because guilt was useless unless it became action. The garage was cold and echoing, the kind of space built to hold engines and secrets. The black Maserati sat under white lights, glossy as a weapon. Carlo rarely drove. Drivers existed for men like him. Tonight he did not want a driver. He did not want witnesses. He did not want his own men between him and the consequence of what he had done. He slid into the driver's seat and closed the door. Rain ticked on the windshield. The leather smelled expensive and familiar, but the silence inside the car was different. No radio, no chatter, no staff presence to buffer reality. The engine started with a low growl that vibrated through the seat into his bones. Carlo pulled out of the estate alone. The gates opened, then shut behind him. For the first time in years, nothing followed. No escort, no lead car, no tail. Just the thin glass of the windshield and the rain-slick road ahead. The city changed as he drove. Manhattan lights fell away behind him. The bridge loomed like a spine across dark water. Rain turned everything into smeared reflections. Red brake lights, white headlights, street signs shining like wet teeth. Carlo followed the address from Reese's file, the only thing he had besides regret. The GPS voice was calm and indifferent, announcing turns with a softness that felt obscene. He entered Brooklyn, then deeper, then into streets that narrowed and darkened. The air outside the car looked heavier here, thick with water and exhaust. Metal grates covered storefronts. Graffiti climbed brick walls like a living thing. Trash bins overflowed into the curb. Some streetlights flickered. Others were dead, leaving pockets of darkness that swallowed corners whole. Carlo parked at the curb and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Rain hammered the roof. The windshield wipers moved in a steady rhythm, sweeping water aside only for it to return. This was where she lived, and he had never asked. He stepped out into the rain. It soaked him in seconds, seeping through his suit, flattening his hair to his forehead. The smell hit him as he approached the building. Damp concrete, old paint, rust, something sour rising from the basement like breath. The entrance door was cracked and patched with clear tape. Inside, the stairwell smelled like wet carpet that had given up on ever drying. The fluorescent hallway light buzzed weakly overhead. Carlo stared up at the stairs. No elevator. He climbed. Each floor stripped something from him. First floor. Trash piled in the corner. A broken stroller leaning against the wall. Second. Barking behind thin doors. A baby crying like it could not afford to stop. Third. Stale cigarette smoke clinging to the air. Fourth. Darkness. A burned-out bulb forced him to feel his way along the rail, the metal wobbling under his grip. Fifth floor. Two doors facing each other like a choice. He stopped at the one marked with chipped numbers. 5-2. Carlo lifted his hand and knocked once. Nothing. He knocked again. Softer. More careful than he had ever been with any door. Behind it, a rustle fast. Panicked. Bare feet on hard floor. Something dragged into place. A chair or a table shoved against the door because the lock did not deserve trust. Carlo's chest tightened. She was afraid. Not of Petrov. Not of enemies. Of a knock. He leaned closer to the door, lowering his voice until it was plain, human, tired. "Reese," he said. "It's Benedetti. I'm alone." Silence held for a few seconds longer, thick and suspicious. Then the scrape of furniture moving back. A lock turned with a small click. The door opened a narrow crack. One eye looked out. Carlo did not step forward. He stayed still, letting her choose the distance. The door opened wider. Reese stood there in an oversized gray hoodie that hung to mid-thigh, sleeves too long, fabric clutched in her fingers like armor. Her hair was wet, not clean wet, but damp from a ceiling leak that dripped steadily into a cheap plastic bucket behind her. Her eyes were swollen from crying, red and heavy, the kind of swelling that came from stopping and starting and never being allowed to finish. She looked at Carlo without fear. Worse than fear, exhaustion so deep it made her expression flat, as if reactions were luxuries she could no longer afford. Carlo's gaze slid past her into the room. A single bed with a thin blanket, a small table, 7 medicine bottles lined in a row like soldiers. No television, no sofa, no rug, bare concrete floor. On the wall opposite the bed, a corkboard crowded with medical bills, each one marked in red. A total written in thick pen, 73,400. Two photographs pinned beside the bills. One of a young woman in a hospital bed, thin and pale, smiling anyway. One of two little girls in oversized donated clothes, hugging each other like they were the only safe thing on earth. Carlo's hand found the doorframe to steady himself. Reese's voice came out rough from crying, hard from life. "What do you want?" she asked. "If you came to threaten me into silence, you didn't need to drive here. I don't know anything." Carlo swallowed. Rain dripped from his hair onto his cheek, and he did not wipe it away. He had come to apologize, but looking at her life bare floor, leaking ceiling, bills stacked like weights, Carlo realized an apology was not a sentence. It was a beginning, and behind his ribs, something colder than guilt took shape. Urgency. Rain slid down the cracked window behind Reese in thin, uneven lines. A drop fell from the ceiling into the plastic bucket, with a hollow plink that repeated every few seconds, steady as a pulse. Carlo stepped inside, only when she moved aside half an inch. The door closed behind him, with a soft scrape of wood against swollen frame. The air in the room was damp and metallic, carrying the faint scent of medicine and old plaster. He stood there in a suit that cost more than everything in the apartment combined, and felt absurd. Reese folded her arms across her chest, not defensive, just holding herself together. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "Whatever you think I know, I don't." Carlo shook his head once. "I'm not here to silence you." Her jaw tightened. "That's what men say before they do." The words landed without drama, just fact. Carlo held her gaze and let the accusation stay between them. "I was wrong," he said. The admission sounded foreign in his mouth, like a language he had once known and forgotten. He felt it scrape his pride on the way out. Reese did not soften. "You were cruel," she corrected. Carlo nodded. The word fit better. "Yes." He looked at the corkboard again. The red numbers. The total circled. 73,400. A debt that would crush most people into silence. He forced his eyes back to hers. "After you left," he said slowly, Gio stood. On his own. Reese's expression did not change at first. Then something small flickered in her eyes, pain, not triumph. "He walked," Carlo added. 3 steps. Toward the door. The bucket caught another drop from the ceiling. Plink. "And he said your name," Carlo finished. Over and over. Reese's throat moved as she swallowed. Her fingers tightened in the fabric of her hoodie. "You saw the footage?" she asked. "Yes." She closed her eyes briefly, as if absorbing a blow that had been delayed too long. "You shouldn't have had to," she murmured. Carlo took a breath. "There's more," he said. Her eyes opened again, guarded. "The housekeeper was feeding information to my enemies," he continued. "For months. Addresses, schedules, staff details." Reese stared at him, processing. "And you think that has something to do with me?" she asked. "It already does." She shook her head. "I'm a nanny." "You lived in my house," Carlo said. "That's enough." The words hung heavy. "Who are your enemies?" she asked quietly. Carlo hesitated. He did not want to drag her further into a world she had never chosen. "Men who do not knock," he said instead. "Men who pressure weak links." Her eyes sharpened. "I'm not a weak link." "No," Carlo agreed. "But you have one." He looked toward the medicine bottles on the table. Reese followed his gaze. Her face drained of color. "Don't," she said. "Which hospital?" Carlo asked, voice steady. Silence filled the room, thick and suffocating. "Why?" she demanded. "Because personnel files were accessed," Carlo said. "If they want leverage, they'll use family." Reese's breathing changed. Faster, controlled but thinner. "Woodhull," she said finally. "4th floor, room 412. Carlo's phone was already in his hand. He stepped aside, turned slightly away from her, and dialed. "Two men," he said when Frankie answered. "Woodhull Medical. Fourth floor, room 412. No one enters without clearance. Now." He ended the call and faced Reese again. "She'll have eyes on her in 15 minutes, he said. Reese searched his face, looking for deceit, for manipulation, for the price hidden inside the offer. "And me?" she asked. "You're not safe here," Carlo replied. A car passed outside, headlights briefly slicing through the thin curtains. Reese flinched before she could stop herself. "I won't go back to your house," she said immediately. Carlo did not argue. "Then come somewhere else," he said. "Hotel. Safe apartment. I don't care. But not here." She stared at him, weighing options she did not want. "And why would you care?" she asked. Carlo did not dress the answer up. "Because I put you in danger," he said. "Because I misjudged you. Because if something happens to you after today, that's on me." Reese studied him for a long moment. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across Brooklyn. "I don't trust you," she said. "You shouldn't," Carlo replied. That seemed to unsettle her more than denial would have. She turned away, grabbed her phone and wallet from the table. Her movements were quick, efficient, practiced. She pulled the older photograph from the corkboard, the one of two little girls in oversized clothes, and tucked it into her hoodie pocket. "That's all you're taking?" Carlo asked. "There's nothing else worth saving," she said. The words were not dramatic. They were inventory. Carlo opened the door and stepped into the hallway first, scanning automatically, eyes moving over shadows and stair corners. They descended the 5 flights in silence. Her steps were light and quick. His were heavy and deliberate. Water dripped from the ceiling in uneven patterns. At the building entrance, the rain had eased to a mist, but the street still shimmered with reflections. Carlo opened the passenger door of the Maserati without ceremony. Reese hesitated for half a second, then got in. He moved to the driver's side, started the engine, and pulled away from the curb. Neither of them spoke as the city blurred past in streaks of wet light. Carlo kept his eyes on the road, hands steady on the wheel. He felt the weight of her silence beside him and did not try to fill it. Somewhere behind them, in a neighborhood he had never bothered to see before tonight, a leaking ceiling continued to drip into a plastic bucket. Ahead, gates would open, and for the first time in years, Carlo was not driving toward power. He was driving toward consequence. The estate gates slid open with a soft mechanical whine. Wet headlights washed the stone pillars in pale light. Then the Maserati rolled through, and the gates sealed behind them with a heavier finality. Metal meeting metal. Reese kept her eyes on the dashboard, knuckles white around the old photograph in her hoodie pocket. Carlo killed the engine and sat for a beat, listening for anything wrong. An unfamiliar car idling, a distant footstep, a change in the rhythm of the security lights. The night held steady. Frankie stood at the front door under the portico, suit darkened by mist. He gave a single nod that said everything without wasting words. Perimeter clear, protocols changed, men deployed. Reese stepped out before Carlo could speak, not fleeing, moving with purpose. Her shoes hit the stone steps, and she walked into the house like someone following a sound only she could hear. It reached them the moment the door opened. Not screaming now, something thinner, exhausted, a whimper that had rubbed itself raw. The sound traveled down from the second floor in loops, soft enough to be ignored by staff, sharp enough to cut anyone who cared. Reese's shoulders lifted on one breath. Then she took the stairs 2 at a time. Carlo followed at a distance, instinct telling him to stay out of the doorway of whatever this was about to become. The nursery door swung open. Warm, yellow nightlight spilled across 2 cribs pushed close together. Arlo and Gio lay curled toward each other, faces swollen, eyes half shut, mouths still making that steady, hopeless sound. Reese crossed the room in 3 quiet steps. Gio heard her first. His head lifted, slow and heavy, as if his neck had forgotten hope. His red eyes blinked once, then locked on her silhouette. The crying stopped like a switch being flipped. The sudden silence made the room feel bigger, and Carlo could hear, with startling clarity, the rain tapping the window. Gio gripped the crib rail and pulled himself upright. The motion was shaky but practiced. His body knew the sequence now. He swung one leg up like he was trying to climb out, wobbling dangerously. Carlo took 1 step forward. Reese was already there. Her hands slipped under Gio's arms and lifted him with an ease that looked like instinct, but was built from repetition. Gio buried his face into her neck, both hands clutching her hoodie like a lifeline. "Ree," he whispered into fabric, the sound muffled but unmistakable. He said it again, fingers tightening. "Ray." Arlo saw and immediately stood, arms reaching through the crib slats, mouth trembling. Reese shifted Gio to her left hip and lifted Arlo with her right arm. 2 small bodies pressed into her at once, one on each side of her neck. She sank to her knees on the nursery rug, not for drama, not for mercy, because her legs finally let her stop running. Tears slid down her face without a sound. They darkened the hoodie already damp from her apartment's leak and the rain outside. Gio's thumb found her collar. Arlo's head rested against her shoulder. Their breathing slowed, matching hers. The room filled with a new sound. Quiet. Carlo stood in the doorway and did not enter. His hands hung uselessly at his sides. He watched the 3 of them kneeling together, and something in his chest, twisted guilt and relief, braided into one rope. After a few minutes, the boys' bodies went heavy. Their eyelids fell shut. Reese eased them back into the same crib without separating them. They refused distance even in sleep. She stood and walked out without looking at Carlo. Not punishment, not forgiveness. A boundary. Carlo followed anyway. Careful, quiet, keeping enough space to show he understood. Downstairs, the kitchen lights were low. The house smelled like clean marble and empty rooms. Reese sat on the stool by the island, shoulders squared, hands around nothing, eyes fixed ahead, as if she was choosing which parts of herself to keep protected. Carlo stopped on the other side of the island and realized he did not know where the coffee was. He opened a cabinet. Glassware. Closed it. Another cabinet. Plates. Closed it. A drawer. Cutlery lined up like soldiers. Closed it. Reese watched him with a flat expression that carried no humor and no pity, only a quiet, brutal truth. He was a stranger in his own home. Carlo found the coffee in the 4th cabinet and froze for a half second, as if the number had weight. He took it out, set up the French press, then stared at it like it was a puzzle meant for a different kind of man. He pulled the instructions from a drawer and read them under the counter light. Lips barely moving, water boiled, a faint hiss. The press plunged with a soft resistance. Steam rose. He poured 2 cups and slid one toward Reese. She did not thank him. She lifted the cup, took a small sip, and set it down. "I learned the glove trick at a center in Hunts Point," she said, voice low, controlled. "Kids with motor delays. We practiced stabilization, friction points. I did shifts for 6 months." Carlo listened without interrupting. The marble under his palms felt cold. "I bought those gloves for $1.99, Reese added, eyes dropping to the mug. "Because it worked." Carlo's throat tightened around an anger that had nowhere to go. Not at her, at himself. At the money he had thrown at problems without ever touching the real solution. He spoke carefully. "Tell me about the call," he said. "The one at night." Reese's eyes flicked up. Sharp. You watched me? She asked. Carlo did not flinch. Yes. A beat of silence stretched. The refrigerator hum filled the gap. My sister, Reese said finally. B. The name came out softer than anything else she had said tonight. She's sick, Reese continued. I do what I can. That's all. Carlo nodded once, absorbing it like another piece of evidence. Except this evidence made his chest ache. He set his own cup down and stared at the dark coffee as if it could hold a confession. My wife, he said. The words were flat, but his hand tightened around the mug until his knuckles went pale. The bomb was meant for me. Reese did not move. She took my keys, Carlo went on. Her car was out of gas. She said she'd be back in 30 minutes. His voice slowed, each word heavier than the last. She died because her car was out of gas. The sentence landed in the kitchen like a dropped glass that didn't shatter, just sank into the floor. Reese's grip on her mug tightened. Her jaw worked once, as if swallowing back something sharp. They sat there with steam rising between them. Two people stripped down to the same thing, beneath money and poverty. Loss. After a long silence, Reese set her cup down with deliberate care. If I stay, she said, calm as paperwork. Carlo lifted his eyes. No uniform, Reese said. Carlo nodded immediately. No one walks into the room when I'm working with the boys, she continued. Not you. Not guards. Carlo nodded again. And I need to know your schedule. Reese finished, voice steady. The boys need to know when you're here. Carlo exhaled once. Slow. Yes, he said. All of it. Reese watched him for a moment longer, then added one more sentence, like a quiet correction to a life lived wrong. Put socks on the boys, she said. The floors are cold. Carlo nodded, as if she had just handed him the first real instruction he'd ever needed. Outside, rain tapped the windows in a softer rhythm. Inside, the house did not feel warm yet, but it no longer felt dead. Morning came thin and gray, squeezed through rain clouds that refused to fully leave. Carlo slept less than 2 hours on the office sofa, suit wrinkled, collar still damp at the seams. When the doorbell rang at 8:15, the sound cut through the house like a blade. He sat up fast, hand already reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. His palm met empty air. The emptiness reminded him, sharply, that this morning was not about guns. Footsteps moved in the hall. Frankie's voice rose at the front door low, controlled, placed like a wall. Then another voice answered, polite but firm, the tone Carlo had heard in 100 different versions over his life. Police. Carlo straightened his vest, ran a hand through his hair, and walked into the foyer. 2 NYPD officers stood on the threshold. The older one held a notebook open. The younger woman stood half a step behind, hand near her belt out of habit. Both of them scanned the interior with quick, professional eyes. Mr. Benedetti, the older officer said, looking down at his notes. We received a complaint from a Dolores Moreno. Carlo's jaw tightened, but his face stayed calm. She alleges an employee here, Reese Holloway, assaulted her and stole property. The officer continued. She has medical documentation and a list of missing items valued at approximately $23,000. We need to speak with Miss Holloway. Carlo felt the shape of the trap immediately. Not just revenge. Strategy. Dolores had chosen the cleanest weapon available. Paperwork, uniforms, and a story designed to drag Reese into handcuffs without a fight. Reese was somewhere upstairs, near the nursery, alone in a house she had been expelled from and returned to in the same day. A foster kid who knew exactly what cuffs meant even when she'd done nothing. Carlo stepped forward so the officers would address him, not the hallway behind. "Officer," he said, voice even, almost friendly. "I appreciate you coming out and doing your job properly." Frankie's eyes flicked to Carlo once, then back to the officers. Still, ready. "But before you proceed," Carlo continued. The older officer's pen paused. "First," Carlo said, "Dolores Moreno was terminated yesterday for theft. Not theft from Miss Holloway. Theft of my late wife's property, jewelry, multiple items, repeatedly, all recorded on a 16-channel security system running 24/7. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. "This is a copy of the footage," Carlo said, holding it out between two fingers like it weighed nothing. "It shows Mrs. Moreno opening a secured jewelry cabinet with a spare key, removing items, and transferring them at my side gate to a third party. Multiple dates, multiple exchanges." The officer's eyes dropped to the USB, then lifted back to Carlo's face. His expression shifted, less authority, more caution. Carlo kept his tone smooth. "Second," he said, "during our review, we discovered Mrs. Moreno has been in frequent contact with individuals my security team identified as connected to a foreign criminal organization." The younger officer's posture changed subtly. Her hand moved a fraction closer to her belt, not threatening, alert. "I have not forwarded this information to any agency yet," Carlo said, "because I preferred to handle matters internally. But if Mrs. Moreno continues filing false reports against my employee, I will forward all evidence to federal authorities. At that point, her accusation becomes the smallest issue attached to her name." He let the sentence end softly, like the final line of a contract. The older officer slowly closed his notebook. "We'll need to review this," he said, voice more measured than before. "If the footage is as you describe, that changes the context." "It does," Carlo replied. The officer nodded once. "We'll follow up if necessary. Have a good day, Mr. Benedetti." The two officers turned and walked down the front steps. The patrol car idled, then pulled away, tires hissing on wet pavement. Carlo watched the vehicle disappear down the quiet street, then shut the door with a controlled click. The house felt too silent again, but not the same dead silence as before. This silence had tension in it, like a rope pulled tight, waiting for another hand to yank. Carlo leaned his back against the door and exhaled. His breath came out heavier than he expected. It wasn't relief. It was the knowledge that Dolores had taken her first swing and would not stop there. When he turned, Reese stood in the living room doorway, holding Gio on her hip. The baby rested his cheek against her hoodie, thumb in his mouth, eyes half-lidded. Arlo hovered near her leg, small hand gripping fabric. Reese's gaze landed on Carlo's face, then flicked to the door. She didn't ask what happened. She already knew. Her eyes carried the flat recognition of a person who had seen systems weaponized before. Carlo spoke first. "She filed a report," he said. "They're gone." Reese studied him like she was looking past his name into the man underneath. "What did you do?" she asked. "I gave them proof," Carlo said simply, "and a reason to leave without making you a headline." Reese's expression shifted, still guarded, but different. Not gratitude, not fear. Assessment. Gio's small hand reached up and patted Reese's cheek, a soft tap-tap like he was checking she was still there. Reese's eyelids fluttered once, then she looked back at Carlo. "You handled it clean," she said. Carlo heard the implication beneath the words. "You didn't make it worse." He nodded once. "I'm trying." Reese adjusted Gio higher on her hip and turned slightly, as if to retreat back into her day. Then she paused. "They'll keep coming," she said, voice low. Carlo's eyes hardened. "I know," he replied. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked softly, one of the guards moving with the new patrol pattern Frankie had set. The sound was small, but it reminded Carlo of something larger. Enemies didn't always arrive with guns. Sometimes they arrived with uniforms and a signature at the bottom of a form. Reese looked at Carlo one last time, then walked toward the nursery without another word. Gio's head turned over her shoulder as they went, eyes finding Carlo briefly, as if marking him the way children do by presence, by scent, by whether the world stays stable when you enter. Carlo stood in the foyer, listening to their footsteps fade up the stairs, and he understood something with a clarity that tasted like metal. This was not over. Dolores had struck once. Petrov was watching, and the next move would not come with a doorbell. Snow fell in quiet sheets, soft enough that the world looked muted, as if someone had wrapped the estate in cotton. The iron fence wore a thin white line along its top rail. The driveway held small prints, two sets of toddler footprints that zigzagged with no logic except joy. Inside, the house carried a different kind of sound now. Not alarms, not hushed footsteps. Laughter, uneven and loud. The kind that bounced off walls that used to hold grief like smoke. The living room no longer looked like a showroom. Quilts in bright colors lay draped across the Italian leather sofa. A pillow fortress occupied the corner where an abstract sculpture used to stand. The Persian rug still sat centered on the floor, but it had stopped being sacred. It had become a stage. Carlo lay on his back on that rug in faded jeans and an old t-shirt, hair uncombed, face unshaven in a way that would have once felt like failure. On his right hand was a sock puppet, stitched from an old pair of socks, button eyes slightly uneven, red thread, mouth crooked in a grin. He lifted the puppet and spoke in a voice that did not belong to boardrooms or basements. "Attention, citizens of Rugtown," he declared with theatrical seriousness. "The tickle monster approaches. No one is safe." A beat of silence. Then Arlo burst from behind the sofa with a sound that was half battle cry, half laugh. Gio followed. Faster. Feet pounding the wooden floor with confidence that used to be impossible. He launched himself at Carlo's stomach with a force that made Carlo grunt for real. But Carlo laughed anyway, loud enough that the windows seemed to shake. Arlo dove on next, hands flying for Carlo's neck. Gio attacked his ribs. The sock puppet flailed helplessly. Carlo twisted under them like he was losing a war, and wanted everyone to know it. "Help," he gasped, eyes squeezed shut in mock agony. "Reese, this is a direct order. Save me." Reese stood in the kitchen doorway with a mug of tea warming her palms. She wore jeans and a sweater. No uniform. Her hair was tied back loosely. The old yellow rubber gloves were no longer on the rug. They rested in a nursery drawer now, forgotten like training wheels after the bike stops wobbling. She took a slow sip of tea and watched Carlo get dismantled by two small children like it was the funniest form of justice. "Sorry, Carlo," she said, calm as a referee. "In this jungle, only the strong survive." Carlo groaned theatrically as Gio climbed onto his chest, triumphant, and Arlo pinned his wrist. The puppet's button eyes stared up at the ceiling in defeat. Reese set her mug down on the counter. Then she dove into the chaos. She dropped to her knees on the rug and tickled Arlo's sides until he squealed and rolled off Carlo. Gio climbed onto Reese's back, laughing until he hiccuped, hands gripping her shoulders the way he used to grip her for balance. Carlo seized the moment to wriggle free, only for Reese to hook an arm around his ankle and drag him back into the pile with a grin that carried no bitterness anymore, just life. 4 bodies rolled across the expensive rug Catalina once chose with careful reverence. Their laughter came in bursts, breathless, messy, real. Carlo lay still for a second, staring up at the ceiling, while 2 small heads rested on his chest and Reese's shoulder pressed against his arm. His heart beat fast, but not from fear, from effort, from presence. Reese's phone buzzed softly on the kitchen counter. She didn't flinch. She reached over, checked the screen, and the corner of her mouth lifted. "It's B," she said. Carlo's eyes softened in a way he hadn't learned until recently. Reese tapped the answer and put the phone on speaker. B's voice came through brighter than it used to be, fuller, like someone breathing with less pain. "You guys outside?" B asked, amused. "Snow inspection," Reese replied. On the rug, Gio lifted his head and made a sound that sounded like B, then laughed at himself as if language was another game. B laughed through the speaker. Warm. Carlo listened to it like it was proof that the world could change without violence. Reese ended the call and sat back on her heels. Arlo's head had slipped onto her thigh, already dozing from play. Gio's cheek rested against Carlo's chest, eyes fluttering. Carlo reached toward Gio's foot, then paused, as if asking permission with his hand. Reese gave a small nod. Carlo slid a sock over Gio's toes with careful fingers, then another on Arlo. His movements were clumsy but patient, like a man learning to speak a language he should have learned years ago. Reese watched him do it without comment. Outside, snow continued to fall, steady and quiet, whitening the road where a black SUV once waited like a threat. Now the only tracks on that road were tiny and crooked, made by children with no concept of danger. Carlo leaned back on the rug, eyes half closed. Reese picked up her mug again and stood, watching the 3 sleeping bodies on the floor for a long moment. 2 toddlers and the man who used to be a fortress. The house felt warm, not because of money or security systems, but because laughter had replaced fear as the loudest sound inside it. Reese bent slightly, pulled a quilt from the sofa, and draped it over Carlo and the boys. Her hand paused at Carlo's shoulder for half a second, light as snowfall. Then she walked back toward the kitchen, tea in hand, footsteps soft. Carlo opened his eyes and watched her go, the quiet in his chest finally settling into something he recognized as peace. A man's true wealth is who runs to him, not who bows.